So, what does this RC car have to do with sim racing? Well, stick around and I'll explain next. What's up, everybody? Thomas Brandon here. Thank you very much, as always, for joining me. And like I said, we're going to be taking a look at this RC car. Now, you might be wondering why on earth we would be looking at a real-life RC car. And this is actually a competitive racing car that my brother gave my son. And you might be wondering what the hell that has to do with sim racing. But we're going to be using it in a little bit of a different situation today. I'm going to use this along with a couple of other things I got sitting up here that you can't see to explain what is still one of the most misunderstood aspects when it comes to race cars, whether it's real life or sim racing, and that is the shocks. All right, now this is going to be a two-part video because this first video, we're going to be talking about how shocks work. Okay, I'm going to be explaining how they work, the way that you want to think about them, whether it's a damper, which is a shock that, you know, that's by itself, or a coilover, right? Something you would see like this, okay? And we're going to be talking about the theory behind it, how you want to think about them, the way that they work, because there's so much that people misunderstand about them. And this is really, really important. We had a really long discussion last week when I was on my live stream where Bruce was asking me some questions as we were waiting for the next race, and I was explaining some stuff. And a lot of the things that I was explaining was counterintuitive to what many people think of when they think of shocks. And about a month ago, it's been a while now, because believe me, I'd actually already started doing this video, and then when I went to edit, which would be this part one, the audio did not record. I don't know what happened, but the audio didn't record, so now I'm redoing it. But I was up in Washington when I had all that stuff going on with my grandma, and I got a link from somebody to a video, and it was the video was somebody, they were doing a shock test. I can't remember exactly what it was. It was testing if you maxed out the shock settings or ran them all at one or something along those lines. It's been a while now, so I don't remember. But the person sent me a link to that and said, hey, what do you think? And can you come up with something explaining this? Obviously, at the time, I was kind of busy with everything going on with my grandma and then her funeral and stuff like that. But I had started working on it. Unfortunately, the audio didn't work. And now, after I had my little chat with Bruce, which people only heard one side of it, which was mine, it raised even more questions. And so here we are. And we're going to be taking a look at shocks in this first video. In the next video, I'm going to actually be in the sim explaining stuff, showing you the things that you need to know about shocks in the sim. And we're going to do some comparisons, because this is something that gets talked about constantly, right? You know, should you just max out all your shock settings? Should you just put them all to, you know, if it's the next gen car, to 5, or even the trucks and the Xfinity? Should you just run them all at the minimum, right? What should you do? Why do they work the way they work? You know, those types of things. So we'll be looking at that in part 2. In this one, we're going to be talking about shock theory, and understand that this is both sim and real life. And this is really important. And you need to know the shocks in iRacing work the way they should work, meaning they work like real world shocks do. The physics work. They really do. Now, on the dirt side, they don't work as well as the asphalt side, but that has more to do with the tire than the shock. And this is important. Remember, the sidewall of a tire is basically its own little spring, okay? And so that combined spring rate, when you look at the spring rate of the spring, considering the motion ratio and all this stuff like that, when you look at wheel deflection and then you look at the actual deflection of the tire, all of those have what is a combined spring rate. It's very, very complex, okay, in real life and in the sim. The shocks are what control all of that, or basically time all of that. And if you have tires, right, that the physics on them are not quite there, it will affect the way the shocks work. So the dirt shocks do work, they do their jobs the way that they're supposed to, but not as well as the asphalt side. Now on the asphalt side, the shocks work well. And I actually sat down with a buddy of mine who I've met through sim racing and have known now for over a year, Scott Monksgard. He's a former NASCAR shock engineer. He worked on like top level NASCAR teams, and he's worked on racing, he worked on racing shocks for like 30 years. Like, he knows his stuff. And we sat down and looked at a bunch of data, tested stuff, right? He is an avid sim racer himself, and he even was like, dude, this stuff works the way that it should, right? It's not 100% to the T accurate, but it does work the way it should. So understand the stuff that I'm going to talk about in this video is transferable real life and sim. Okay, so that all being said, let's get this thing started. Okay, so the first thing that you need to understand about a shock is that a shock is essentially a timing device. Okay, that's what a shock is. Now, when it comes to a shock, what we have here is, this is a coilover shock. This is off of that RC car down here. And whether it's a coilover or it's a damper, right, which is just the shock without a spring, right, by itself, they're a timing device. And when you think about shocks, the easiest way to think about them is to think about them in terms of weight transfer, or absorbed weight, which is what a shock absorber does, or applied force. Okay, now when I say applied force, what am I talking about? What I'm talking about is this: if we took this shock and we made it as stiff as possible, what would happen is as the weight transfers on the car, as it transfers over, if this shock is stiff, it's going to push down and apply that force to the wheel, to the tire, the contact patch. If this shock is soft, what'll happen is now the shock's going to absorb the weight, and more of that force is going to be absorbed by the shock as opposed to applied to the wheel. To give you an example of this, if we look at this right here, okay, if I take this, right, if we have weight transfer over to this side, right, and it's stiff, okay, you got to think about this pushing down on my hand. Meanwhile, this side over here where there's nothing, okay, there's no weight that's being applied to the contact patch until it bottoms out. Okay, I hope that makes sense. To illustrate this another way, if I take this spring right here, all right, if I take this and I push it down on my hand, right, it's applying that force down through the spring to the contact patch. Okay, but if this shock is super, let's just say there's a shock here and it's super soft, it's now being compressed, it's being absorbed by the shock, and it's not making it to the actual contact patch. This is why you will see race cars, whether it's real life or the sim. Yeah, if you look at like the dirt side, for example, you can see a car where it's rolling over, right? You could think of midgets, for example. Watch a dirt midget in real life. Okay, front ends bouncing all over the place, but when they're going into the corner, you're not seeing them roll all the way over onto the right rear. Okay, the reason you don't see that is if they did that, they'd have no grip on the right rear. What happens? They go into the corner and they roll some, but they're essentially standing up, right? You can see that right rear is a lot stiffer than that left rear, and the reason is because they want that thing to roll over and press that tire into the ground. All right, and that's what's going to give you that drive. Now, that right there is compression. What about rebound? And this is really where people get messed up. When it comes to the rebound of a shock, it's the opposite, okay? So the easiest way to think about it is this. When we look at compression, all right, the stiffer the shock, or the slower moving the shock, all right, the faster the weight transfer to the contact patch. Okay, so if it's a stiff shock on the compression, all right, when that weight transfers over to the corner, okay, when that weight comes transferring over to the corner, if it's stiff, it's going to press that tire down. the shock is not going to absorb as much weight. It's going to push it down, the tire into the ground. All right, if it's a stiffer shock on the compression side. If it's a softer shock, what's going to happen is that weight's going to come over here and just boom. We're not going to get any applied force. We're going to get all the weight absorbed to the corner. Okay. On the rebound side, it's the opposite, meaning the stiffer the shock, the less load that's being applied as force. All right. The softer the rebound, the more load. Okay. To illustrate this, if you imagine our little spring that we had here again, after we compress it down, now when it's in the rebound phase, what is it doing? Well, it's actually pushing up, right? This spring wants to extend, which does what? It's going to lift the body up, but also push that tire back into the ground, okay? Because it's in the rebound phase. If I take this and I tie this down with a rebound shock, I could get this thing in here. Apparently my son was in here playing with this. If I tie this down with a rebound shock, now on the compression side of things, or excuse me, on the rebound side of things, now this spring is compressed. When the weight goes to transfer, what do I have? Well, I've got a spring here that's not applying any force, right? It's just compressed. You're literally getting what's called down and out, or jacked down, where the shock is so tight that it won't even compress. Or excuse me, it won't even extend. You're driving off that corner. The weight's on that left rear, but it's not being applied to the left rear. Remember, there's a big difference there. Okay, so if you've got less rebound, okay, now when you're driving up off, that thing is extending up, and you're actually getting that force to be applied back down to the contact patch. All right, so remember, when it comes to the settings, okay, the stiffer the bump, all right, the faster the weight is applied to the tire. All right. On the rebound, the stiffer the bump, or excuse me, the stiffer the rebound, the slower the weight is applied to the tire. Okay. Remember that. All right. If you can remember just that, you'll be light years ahead of the vast majority of people when it comes to shocks, because they are very, very complex. And this is the thing that I want you to understand. Shocks are the one component on a race car in real life that has its own specialist, right? I mean, you've got shock specialists. That's all they do. It's one component on the car, and there is a shock specialist. That's all they do, is tune shocks, and it's because they are that important when it comes to the ride and feel, comfort, and handling of your car, whether it's real life or sim racing. They are extremely important. Okay, so I hope that helps some in this video, but like I said, I just wanted to kind of give you some theory on how shocks work, both real life and sim, because like I said, it is transferable. The shocks in iRacing do work like they should in real life. So that way, when we get to part 2 and we start looking at this in the sim, it'll make a whole lot more sense. So I hope this helped you, okay? But that's going to do it all for this video for part 1. Thank you very much, as always, for joining me. Now, please, if you like this, hit the like button. If you've got any questions or anything like that, leave it down in the comments below, and I'll try to get to them and answer those questions for you, because like I said, I know that this thing can be confusing. And like I said, make sure that you are subscribed and got the notification bell ticked for part 2, which will be out tomorrow. You know, I'm recording it. I'll be recording it literally in 30 seconds, but the video will be out tomorrow, so that way you can see that as well. But that'll do it. Thank you very much, as always, for joining me. Until next time, I want to wish you good luck, good racing,